Great. I think, well, let's get started. Hello, all. My name is Tyler Ken. I'm the, now Director of Exhibitions and Pizzuti Family Curator of Contemporary Art at the Columbus Museum of Art. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Molly Jo Burke and Nathan Gorgen. This conversation comes on the occasion of our annual Greater Columbus exhibition, which features really outstanding artists from our, local community, Central Ohio. It's a partnership between the Columbus Museum of Art and the Greater Columbus Arts Council, as the name Greater Columbus might suggest. And I have to say, it's been a really great way for the museum to connect with its local community of artists. And it's been a really fun thing to do year on. And this year, of course, has been this past year has been an unusual and difficult year. We have pushed this exhibition not only in time, but in space. It was meant to open at the Pizzuti collection of the Columbus Museum of Art, but it is now open as of November 6th at our Broad Street location, which is open. And the exhibition will be up until the 25th of April. I should also mention that weekends this month of January are all free, so do come and see the show. It's it's great. It features not only the two artists with us here, but I will also mention Christopher Burke, Nick Larson, and Laura Larson, as well as Derek Gill and Chaz O'Neill. I should also mention that neither of the Burkes or Larsons are related, but the two of you are. So Columbus-based artists Molly Jo Burke and Nathan Gorgen are an artist and designer couple and parents of young children, and they collaborate on artwork that raises issues of environmentalism and waste, as well as the nature of materials and objects that surround there and also our everyday lives. They have quite different individual practices, and I think we'll get into, in the course of this conversation, sort of how how that works and the kind of waste stream, as you call it, it's sort of like is reinserted back into your kind of collaborative practice. So, but without further ado, hello, Nathan and Molly. It's great to see you.
Yeah.
Hi.
Great to be here.
Yes, we're very excited to be invited, not only through have the fellowship awarded to us, but also to have the opportunity to talk about our artwork with Columbus. So, so we will kind of jump right in. So my background is in glass and ceramics, sculpture, and kind of installation. And I graduated from Columbus College of Art and Design with a BFA, and then went on to get a Master of Fine Arts with an emphasis in glass from Ohio State University. And then I proceeded to, from there, practice in studio art, but also teaching and administration in the arts in Columbus. I worked at CCAD for a number of years, and I'm currently pursuing my PhD at the Ohio State University through the Arts Administration, Education, and Policy area. And my focus is really considering that how are artists successful and what kind of pathways can emerging visual artists take to kind of achieve that success. So I'm still figuring it out, as many PhD students are, but really harnessing the fact that my experience in teaching and working as an artist, and how can I help other artists to achieve those goals. So
yeah, and my background, my artistic background is in painting and making slowly transitioning to sculpture and installation and furniture making I did my undergrad at Maryland Institute College of Art and my grad studies at CCAD. And now, in addition to my practice, I'm working as the shop manager for the Studios for Art and Design Research, which is the fabrication and excuse me. It's the digital fabrication and wood shop for the departments of art and design at OSU. So should we start with the slides?
Sure.
Yeah.
So we wanted to introduce a little bit of imagery from our own, is it full screen already?
Yeah.
Okay, there you go.
There we go. Yes, I can see it.
So as you can see, this is one of our days installing the show we had a year ago in Illinois. And this is what it's been like to be parents and artists, and so I think that's something that anybody who is an artist and a parent can probably relate to.
Yeah.
But it's extra interesting.
Curators too, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. So anybody installing art shows.
I feel I have been there.
Yeah.
So this was when my youngest daughter Athena, our youngest daughter Athena, was a year old, and we had driven 6 hours to Illinois to install the show.
Immediately installed the show upon arrival.
Yes, and she just kind of
she sacked out.
Finally sacked out. It took carrying her. She did not nap in the car.
Yeah.
So, but what we wanted to talk about a little bit is actually, is it gonna move?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think. Oh, there we go.
There we go.
So Nate's gonna introduce a little bit of his work. This is pre collaboration.
So this is from 2015. This is work that I actually did for a exhibition at Roy G. Biv Gallery back when they were still in the Short North. And this just shows some of my, focuses and concerns with the art I was making at the time. Looking a lot at, still very involved in painting, both in more traditional sense and then also painting on objects. I've been interested in a long time in trompe l'oeil painting and faux painting in particular, recreating textures of various types of materials, sort of a decorative art form that's been used traditionally to depict high value materials that maybe someone couldn't afford. And I was working on kind of trying to turn that on its head a little bit by depicting low value materials using these sort of classic techniques. So for example, like the painting that you see above is just a faux finish of like some knotty pine board that you would find like from Home Depot or Lowe's. And I was kind of interested in messing around with the value system of faux painting by depicting these materials. And then below that is a urinal from a portable toilet that I have faux finished in Carrara marble to kind of spruce it up a little bit.
Yeah.
Following a fairly long tradition going back to Marcel Duchamp of looking at questions of value, and in this kind of form in particular.
Yeah, totally.
Actually, at the museum itself, there is in its historic restroom a kind of very similar Carrara marble facility, let's say.
Yeah. At the same time that I was doing this, I was actually working for a faux finishing and other, kind of all-purpose studio. And one of the jobs that we did was we actually came in and did some faux finishing in the museum when they did their restoration. So actually, I like to tell people that the first painting I ever got in that museum is actually a little piece of terrazzo floor in the mezzanine of the old building. That was plastered over, and we repainted it to look exactly like the terrazzo that's already there. So, all right.
There was a question in the chat, and I should encourage our viewers to put any questions in the chat or the Q&A function. We really encourage this to be a dialogue, and we will get to a moment where we're asking you for questions. So if you have that in mind, just shoot it and we'll, but the question was, what is the words on the painting?
Oh, so yeah, that there aren't really any particular words. Basically, you'll see a lot of times with lumber, particularly, there's a code stamped onto each piece that has like where it's from, the company, some information. If you're a contractor or somebody who's like bidding on like large quantities of wood for projects and stuff, that is a decipherable information. I wasn't really interested too much in like.
I think you did change them a little.
I changed them a little bit. I think like, but I was mostly interested in the visual, and just that kind of like, it's like a weird stamp of authenticity. And I didn't really get into like the poetics of like the words and things like that very much beyond like having them slapped on there, and just another way to like play around with that value proposition.
Well,
I think they're spray painted with a stencil or something,
I think an interesting part is that like Nate and I have a fascination with, and you'll see it in the later works, this kind of fascination with construction materials that like are actually really quite beautiful colors and textures, but then often they get covered up with the higher end stuff. And so I think that there's almost an homage to like the fact that these things are in themselves like quite interesting and sometimes beautiful. So and actually in this next piece you can see that coming through if you want to talk about the materials there.
Yeah, so this is a more recent, this is sort of post collaboration, and as we get more through the presentation, you'll probably start to see where some of the influences for this piece come from. But working in a similar vein of reproduction and questions about artistic reproduction, but in this case dealing with digital reproduction, and this is a piece I was able to make basically because of where I work at Ohio State. We have a pretty extensive suite of digital fabrication tools, including like 3D scanners, laser cutters, CNC mills, and routers. And I was kind of made this piece as a meditation on the transition between natural materials and synthetic materials, also as a demonstration of what's possible using some of the equipment that we have. So the piece of wood is just a box elder maple burl, but we 3D scanned it and then reproduced it by carving it out of insulation foam, and then carving an acrylic top on the laser cutter. And so the acrylic top encourages some reflection. So you can literally see the wood in the slab below, which is like a mirror image. So there's an interesting kind of back and forth between this sort of beautiful natural form and its synthetic cousin.
Yeah, so this kind of artifice, this like back and forth play between reproduction.
So this plexiglass and urethane, is it? It juts out at a right angle.
Polystyrene, but yeah, it comes out. It juts out as a shelf. It sticks out as far from the wall as it is tall.
To give you an idea of scale, like this is something that like
it's about 2 feet wide.
A little more than 2 feet wide. It's pretty big, so it's almost like could be a bar shelf to some degree. It's that large. So.
Yeah, it's also sort of a part of my ongoing exploration into more morphing sculpture into furniture and sort of going back and forth with that dialogue.
So to talk a little bit about, so this is a pre-collaboration work for me. My work, my own practice tends to focus a lot on natural and organic forms and this idea of chaos theory. So this repetition of similar shapes that occur repeatedly in our environment. Some thinking along the lines of like the lining of your intestines with the villi might be really similar to the way that an anemone functions in the ocean. So this kind of filtration working, you see that same architecture occurring. In this particular piece, I was really interested in this kind of egg form really noticing how beautiful those particular shapes are. And I was trying to recreate them using a material called hydrocal, which is a type of plaster. And these particular pieces balance very delicately on the shelf. And when I say delicately, they actually don't move unless you were to like knock them off the shelf like a normal object. So it's a very interesting, seems precarious, but is actually very sturdy. And then kind of playing with this idea of personality and form by creating these kind of narrative titles. So this particular piece is called Don't Touch Me. And we have this kind of group clustered to one side and this other egg form off, kind of feeling isolated and also an alarmingly orange color. So, and then when we move into the newer work, this is done in 2020 at a show I had through Sherry Gallery, who represents me here in town. This piece is Fuchsia Abundance, and this particular series of work I was really focusing on kind of this idea of reminiscing about the past. And so I was looking to vintage kind of retro Hollywood colors, like thinking a lot about like, you know, the Wizard of Oz and kind of some of those things from like viewing TV in my childhood, and that kind of like almost oversaturation. And so I was also mirroring these objects, thinking that people would see their reflection even more so in the glass. And whether that was something to allow you to think or actually to promote like that idea of narcissism. So I feel like there's a real dichotomy happening right now where, you know, is looking to the, you know, how we view things really shifts, and the way we view things, and kind of thinking on that. And then the forms themselves are actually referencing also coral reef kind of environments. And so you can see that there's an absence of color. So, you know, whether that's an environmental issue or not, but still very beautiful. And
yeah, actually it makes me, you know, I'm sort of picking up on a connection actually between your two independent practices on the level of like propositions of value and what we consider kind of precious, whether it's sort of materials like Carrara marbles or this kind of like, you know, vintage sort of jewel like materials, but also fragility. You know, the wood versus the more sort of like synthetic materials, kind of there is, I would say, a sort of analog in your practice, Molly, as well around that.
Yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that. Sometimes it's hard for me to verbalize it too.
It's my job.
So now we wanted to move, like, for this, we'll talk a little bit about how we started out collaborating, which, you know, as you saw in the first picture that we presented, as us with an exhausted child, ourselves exhausted, installing a show. And so we actually started collaborating in 2017, about a year after our first child was born, Persephone. And this is actually the second piece we made together, which we know because we did methodically label these initial pieces with numbers. So, and it was very specific about, like, we were nervous about not having time to make artwork as working professionals who had a career in the arts. So making art was important for our actual day jobs, but it wasn't the center point. And adding that complexity of parenthood really was something that we were like, oh no, like, is art going to the side? Like, what are we gonna do?
Yeah. Well, everything goes to the side.
Yeah.
I mean, parenthood is a radical decentering of oneself. So yeah, I understand that feeling when sort of everything gets pushed to the margins. I mean, it starts to recede after a little while, and you kind of regain a certain level of your own life.
And art making at all was basically impossible while she was like a true infant. I mean, as you know, that's a crazy headspace. But to get kind of back into the groove of things, you know, we created this collaboration, and you know, it was not only a way to like kind of, I guess, maximize our art time, you know, but also, you know, by joining forces, we were able to really motivate each other too, and both had a stake in what the other person, more of a stake, I would say, even than before, in what the other person was doing.
Right.
So that was really helpful in order to, you know, it's like having a gym buddy or like going on a diet with somebody else. You're like, you kind of need the motivation of having somebody like else be like, hey, we need to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the interesting part was that like Nate and I are actually both middle children. And so I've heard a lot of people say like, I could never collaborate with my husband or my partner. Like we would just argue too much. But I think that because we grew up always having to negotiate, we're like actually very good at working through it.
Yeah.
without getting, like, I think we've had a very limited number of arguments in the number of years we've been collaborating as a couple on artwork, but also just in general. So
yeah, and we did set up a pretty rigid system for the collaboration, which also helped a lot. Like there was some pre-negotiation about how exactly that was going to work.
Right. Yeah, that was actually, I was going to ask exactly about that.
Yeah. So basically, the jumping off point for these pieces are the skeletons of projects that have been cut out on the CNC from my work. So basically, the CNC router cuts out linear forms out of sheets of plywood, among other things.
And so you can actually see in this particular piece the white section with the knobs kind of coming out of the surface, the bumps. That's an opening. The triangles are also an opening. And then interestingly enough, like I didn't even know what this was until Nate explained it to me, but those ridges on the side, that are filled with Bondo in this particular piece, the blue and kind of that fleshy red, that's actually for aligning everything, right?
Yeah, it's a calibration test.
I see.
You draw a right angle and then you measure the distance between the two, and it, you know, if it actually works out to the Pythagorean theorem, then you know that your machine is straight and you can keep working. So basically, we have a lot of these churning out of my shop. You know, every time somebody makes something, they have this throwaway piece, basically. And I, you know, as you know, we'll get into more into the environmental economics of all of this stuff, but obviously that's like a pretty significant waste product. And if you think about it, you know, this is like probably half of the wood of that is actually still there. You know, so I started to feel a little guilty, and we decided to use those as a jumping off point for making work. So we had a set of these and basically had kind of like a skull session about what we were going to do with them. And the idea was that the first person who had like a real kind of passionate insight about what we should do, not just like, oh, we should maybe do this, maybe do that, but the person who felt really strongly about a way to start the piece got to take it. And then once they had sort of
done a first iteration,
then they handed it back to the other person. They worked on it, and then it goes back again to the person who had that initial spark of insight to kind of put the finishing touches on it. And each person is given a veto in the process too. So, you know, you have to clear what you're doing with the other person. They only get one veto though. So it's like, you can't keep shooting down ideas. So it's like, you got to pick your veto.
Right. Really. That's one veto per piece?
Yeah.
Well, gotcha. It was per session.
Oh, no, not many vetoes. And we didn't need to veto each other that frequently. You know, it's like, save that for extreme circumstances.
I think like with any brainstorming, like if you were talking out loud and the other person was like, oh, like you're kind of like, oh, maybe that's not a good idea. So,
yeah.
But I do think that what I really enjoyed about this was that, you know, we'd been viewing each other's artistic practices for many years leading up to the collaboration. And there were always things that I had wanted Nate to do with his work and he wanted me to do with mine. And I think this was like a really wonderful opportunity to explore challenging each other in that way. And so even though like maybe I took the lead on like what the piece might be like, or Nate took the lead, like a lot of times what we were also doing was directing the other person to what we wanted them to do.
Yeah.
And so there was so even if it was like technically my iteration, it might actually have been like, Nate, I really want you to do some marble texture on this or something like that. So it was kind of freeing in that way, because it's a mix of like art direction and then just like working in the artistic flow.
Yeah.
Right. And you can pick up something in the other person's practice that you think, actually, I think this would be, if you could do this, that would be really great. So that involves a certain amount of kind of like knowledge of what the other person's capabilities and strengths, might be, and what you love about not only that person, but also their work, to kind of come through. And I think it's really interesting how not only have you sort of like joined the ranks of artists who are making work out of the conditions of a domestic situation of parenthood. I mean, I think of Lenka Clayton, for example, who runs this art, or has this sort of artist's residency in motherhood, as it's called. And whose work, for a long time was derived exactly from those kinds of conditions, but now also the conditions of partnership, and kind of collaboration. So that is, I think you're to be commended twice on the ability to kind of like do that. I think it's great.
So the interesting part was that with these materials, the plywood is pretty heavy, and we were also using a lot of like remnants of plaster leftovers, because after a while, plaster and the hydrocal essentially will start to degrade. So you have a shelf life for a lot of this stuff. And so I think that's where some of it became this combination of using what we had previously, but also trying to use up materials so that we weren't wasteful.
Yeah.
And this piece is actually quite large. It's 48 inches by 42. There's absolutely
48 by 52.
48 by 52.
Yeah.
Well, you put the wrong number on there.
Oops.
But it's actually, I mean, it's like we can't fit this in our house. So, but it is one of those favorite pieces that gets installed, cool. I think in almost not this show, but it's been in a lot of shows. And you can actually see in the detail shot on the right that there is a revealing of the materials. This like, the glue is actually kind of foamed up around the piece, and we've exposed the polystyrene that's visible through there, the EPS foam. But then it's actually mimicking very nicely the colors that Nate has used in the faux finishing, which is actually also on polystyrene. So this huge piece is actually quite lightweight because we've been using this polystyrene, which apparently will never degrade, is what I'm. So, yay!
Better or worse. Yes.
So.
Yeah, the blessing and the curse of plastic is like.
And what was nice is I think the other thing is that Nate and I both have a very strong foundation in art and design. So like these design principles. So utilizing open space and voids, which I think we should probably try to do more of. No, I'm looking at it again.
Yeah,
but
it was nice.
It's a nice feature to kind of have that design moment. So. So this is some other earlier works from our collaboration. This particular show is from 2020, but the works on the left-hand side of the screen are from 2017. We had a show at Urbana University. And then the works on the back wall are from a show that we had in Kent, Ohio at Tropus Gallery, which is actually a really lovely space. So if anybody's up in Kent, definitely check it out.
Yeah.
And the title and date of the sculpture in the center of the gallery?
So that's our ongoing. That's our first collaboration.
Ongoing.
So
gotcha.
It's interactive. Yeah.
We're still feeding it.
Yeah.
That's Persephone. We call her Percy for short, and she's 4. Yeah. She's really enjoying that. That was a very large open space, so she was having a great time.
Yeah. It's important that if you take a 5-hour car ride to Illinois, you immediately find a gallery for your child to run around in.
An empty-ish gallery.
Empty-ish, yeah. No floor sculptures there, which was good.
Yeah, she was definitely a dragon at that moment. Yeah. So those pieces on the left-hand side, I think, start to do this shift between, I think the very first series was very kind of landscape oriented. Nate and I had traveled quite a bit together before we had children. I think most people tend to do that, it seems. But then, maybe not most people,
At least
but
more than they do.
more
After
than they do after they have kids. But I think that we were starting to shift more towards these forms, kind of breaking the frame of reference. And then, and still landscape focus, still kind of tied to this use of materials. Like that's one thing that was really important with the initial foray into this was like, yes, we're going to use up our materials. We're thinking about being environmentally conscious about what we're doing. And then the images on the back wall, we kind of started to move more to like this existential crisis of like, what do you do with all this stuff that you start acquiring that just happens to be in your life?
Yeah, a lot of the work that we were doing prior to this iteration still involved mostly art supplies. Some construction material, but really it was, and this is where we first started to bring in more material from our everyday lives, from our lives with Percy, and now Athena.
Yeah. So what you can see in the top green piece is actually inclusions of pom-poms, which are like these little
tiny little
craft fabric supply that I had purchased for a party, like a birthday party for kids crafting. And I was just like, what am I gonna do with these things?
Yeah, we probably had like a giant bag of them, and just like,
but they were still so fun and like festive, and then the bag explodes and it's all over your dining room. But I think that it was nice to think about just like this use of objects that like, I might have just thrown that in the garbage just to get it out of the way, but at the same time, now it's become immortalized in this piece that really has this obscuring and revealing component with the way that the wax has some transparency, but is like this kind of veil.
That translucency that sort of allows things to kind of emerge like from the depths of the wax. We've used that a lot, especially kind of going forward from this point onward. Also bringing more color into the work, which I think is an inevitable result of
having
kids.
Children. Yeah.
It's just like,
everything's primary color. No, so I do think that again, like kind of dealing with that almost existential crisis of what to do with things was really and not just the art materials, but actual things that we were using. So then this is moving to the current body of work, which is actually titled we've been focusing on existential byproducts currently. Previously it was expanding waistline. And these pieces are actually utilizing the waste materials from home renovation projects. So we've moved from traveling. Now we only demo bathrooms. I'm just joking.
We just remodel. We endlessly remodel our house. So these both, or the two pieces to the right, feature wallpaper that's been used in bathroom renovations, both upstairs and downstairs in our Cape Cod. I think that there are some other little trace elements as well. We have continued to include like little glass bits and some of that, some air dry clay type things.
And wax.
Yes, can't forget about the wax.
We also took a moment. So a lot of the glass remnants, like I still blow glass probably about 2/3 of the year. Like every week I'm typically in the hot shop in some fashion. And Nate's always kind of like, wow, we have a lot of stuff in the basement. And I was like, well, every time I go to the hot shop, I make something. Like it's like inevitable. Like it happens easily.
Right.
As far as acquiring volume of material.
It's one of the hazards of a sculptural practice, no matter what, is that you make these things and then they exist, and you need to find space for them when they're not on view somewhere.
Yeah, and so it's actually been, and it's hard because I see all these little bits and components, and they're still quite lovely. And we actually have been very happy and grateful that we're able to include them in these pieces, and they have a second life. But also, we started to vacuum form. Over on top of these, because the texture that is there is quite interesting. And it also reminds me of that moment of like this kind of obtaining an object that's been packaged,
Yeah.
and that like vague memory of what it's like to try to open up that package from, Lowe's or Home Depot, that you're like having to carefully use your X-Acto knife or box cutter to get
Yeah,
there.
that's also something that's
Yes.
become.
So I should just say for our viewers, that is the central black panel that we are looking at here in this image.
Yeah, and the one on the far right is also, it's a less obvious, but there is a vacuum formed layer of clear plastic over the glass components that are in that kind of larger void.
And that's like what's holding those pieces in.
Yeah.
And the interesting part is some of the pieces had fallen out after we vacuum formed. They came out, and I didn't leave them in there, especially in the black one. But then some of them stayed in, like they were stuck. So
yeah, if you don't vacuum form correctly, the vacuum will suck down and completely envelop the form, and then it's kind of trapped in there. So they're
in there.
Sort of like interesting. It's like, in some ways, it's almost like a archival mechanism. It's like a preservation, like preserving things in amber. But on
Trapped
the
in
other hand,
amber,
it's also like this very commercialized method for like packaging things for distribution. Like anybody who's ever bought any kind of doll or figurine or anything like that is familiar with that, like double plastic packaging mess that is ever present.
And to be clear, we were kind of like, I wonder what stuff is going to stay in it.
Yeah.
So we knew that we were like dealing with chance as far as like some things would remain and some things would go away.
Some things would be a kind of like left there, almost like a memory in the form of that shape, and other things would still be there.
Yeah, it was a really pretty fascinating,
but unseen
experiment. Because I had actually just recently built like a very large vacuum former for my job at work, for the students to use, and this was part of our artistic experimentation, and also part of my experimentation for work to figure out like best practices for using it. It was a very interesting process. If you've never vacuum formed anything and you're an artist, you should try it because it's super fun.
It turns out aluminum foil is really good for
filling in those little spaces between things.
So
yeah.
I will say the piece on the far left, kind of thinking about that idea of memory, is we were flowing the wax kind of over the wallpaper and obscuring it and revealing it and kind of fading it in between those two. And we did want that particular piece to be a little bit, even though there's a lot of colors and shifting between the grids, like we didn't want to add too many parts to it. And so it is really more about this idea of controlling how much is revealed or not revealed, and what we see and what we don't see.
Yeah, which is related with the other ones, though, to maybe a more maximalist effect.
Mm-hmm. So this kind of continues that this actually is like a really huge jump, like kind of the first into the object world for us, as far as like getting completely away from the wall. And I think that what was nice is it was incorporating some new skills that Nate had kind of started working on with turning on the lathe.
Yeah, creating these kind of bowl-like forms is something that I've been, again, something I'm learning how to do for work.
And enjoyment.
Yeah. It is pretty fun. So my experimentation with that led to the creation of these forms. I'm interested in playing with the wood, and almost out of the jealousy of what Molly gets to do in her glass practice to make these like small kind of like precious items. Using the lathe is probably the easiest way to do things like that in terms of woodworking. And also I'm using here, all the wood is sustainably sourced, so it's all like from trees that have just kind of fallen down. Like this particular bowl is made from walnut that was from a tree that my brother cut down at his house in New York to make way for his solar panels. So so it's like I'm
also
just
to protect his house.
Yes, also so it doesn't fall on his house. But I'm trying to find waste wood that would be sent to the chipper or somebody's wood stove. Not trying to like buy anything, especially this kind of nicer stuff like the walnut and things like that. I mean, it's abundant when you know where to look, which is
Yeah.
another really interesting thing that probably is true
Yeah.
of most of the materials that we use.
But then there is this like a highly synthetic material that's sort of poured over it. So I feel like there is, I mean, it's something that we all live with, is this kind of cognitive dissonance around kind of concern around, and a kind of like maintaining some ethical way through the world and our environment. And at the same time, the kind of, you know, seemingly necessary compromises that we make with, you know, with the environment.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's really sort of played out in your use of both these kind of, you know, organic cast-offs, but also these, you know, resiny or plastic kind of materials.
Yeah, I think that it's kind of strange because it looks, I always have people tell me that they look almost delicious, and I was like, oh,
Yes,
never
it's almost like a melted ice cream.
Yeah.
Mhm. But the color is so, again, this is like the silicone that we've, so this is actually a platinum cured silicone that's been poured over the walnut bowl form. And the insert, it's a little challenging to see, but the insert at the very top of that bowl, and we'll see another image from the downstairs bathroom, that's actually the bathroom floor of our upstairs bathroom that we had to take out.
Demolished.
And one thing, I'm not sure I mentioned it yet, but the house that we live in was actually owned by the previous family for 70 years. So they had almost like a single occupant or single family that
Really
lived here.
Almost no remodeling.
And they took really pristine care of most of the spaces and had not updated it. But unfortunately, like there were starting to be some structural damage. And so we did have to kind of move forward with changing things, because turns out the floor choice was right in fashion. It was like this kind of interesting millennial pink terrazzo linoleum.
It was from like 1950.
Yeah, and it had like glitter inclusions. I was like, there's like glitter in the floor.
Yeah,
so and so we actually have been very carefully like selecting from this like chunk of like 4x4 piece of linoleum we have from each bathroom, like using it throughout these projects. But it is really referencing that kind of domestic space with this shape and the size. It's like similar size to a table setting to some degree. We've incorporated these foam blocks, which we have a plethora of that seem to get separated from the pack and end up in random places.
Oh yeah.
And then having these growth forms come out of it that were created with the air dry clay, which happens to be like the exact same color as the foam blocks, like this like continued repetition of these colors happening, which
you have images of the table there that we can see.
Yeah, we do.
Should we go?
We can skip ahead a little, and so you can see
this is the table.
Oh, I see.
So there's the table, and you can kind of see the placement of like almost the objects upon the table. So we did kind of, so I'm gonna head back a little. And so again, like, and so the green color is actually the downstairs bathroom. And then this is actually a wood, the wood from this was also sourced from our neighborhood.
And anytime we hear chainsaws, I go running.
Nate just runs out the door now.
There's wood to be found. And this one was particularly interesting because I kind of made it into like a bowl blank and then forgot about it and came back to it like a year later, and the wood had completely changed. It got basically like a fungal infestation. Like it wasn't really rotten, but it was like sprouting basically all over the place. And this wood had originally been bright white, and it's now completely changed to this kind of golden brown color, which I think is,
and now that it's dried out, it's like really it's interesting because the color is staying. It's like a natural stain. If we look on the left image of the detail, like I'm actually very careful to make sure when I pour the silicone, because it gets these like really nice thin areas, that it coats the surface of the bits. And then it kind of leaves this, again, it leaves a little bit of a stain. So like it creates like a uniform color almost. And I don't know, the similarities between the wax and the silicone, like how they feel and consistency, this kind of almost tissue or bodily component. But then with the wax, it's much more natural. The silicone is obviously this very synthetic material that is a part of our everyday lives. Like, this is like the same kind of material our baking pans are made out of, or those like sheets we use on the countertop.
So here, like in many of the works, the organic material is shaped into this kind of quite non-organic form of almost a sphere here, but and it's clearly sort of not the original form of the tree, and clearly sort of machine or handmade. But then the synthetic material, the man-made, human-made material, takes the form of this really organic, coral-like shape, almost like a kind of fungal accretion that you mentioned itself. So yeah, I mean, that again is kind of this interesting, I think, mix of dichotomies.
Yeah, it's definitely playing on that artifice there. And actually the pink, like the disc-like forms, are actually beads I stole from Percy's little beading kit.
It's like a necklace kit.
Yeah, I feel a little bad about that, but I also am like,
they put too many beads in there anyway. It's
so,
like,
yeah,
anything that she drops on the floor is fair game for us.
Fair game.
Sometimes I'm knocking it off the table.
It's like, oh, that's a nice one.
Kind of break the rules. So, so then we had decided to display these on this long shelf. This was again from the Illinois show. That this is actually 32 feet of shelving that has kind of a live edge, and we figured out a system for connecting it together that
made it continuous. And really kind of again referencing that domestic space and the fact that like we live in a small house, we have a lot of objects around us, and we wanted this to feel very full but also very playful, kind of that back and forth play. And so you can kind of see that there are places to stop and like a moment of pause between each one, but it is a very quick kind of succession. And we wanted to kind of continue that feeling with the work in the museum. And and if you want to talk about the tables, you can. Yeah, let's go ahead. And one thing that's important to note, I think, about these is that the individual pieces aren't really labeled as such. It's really thought of as being more like an installation.
It's an accumulation.
The accumulation of objects all together is really an important part of the overall piece, as opposed to being, and that also kind of reinforces the fact that like the furniture that we make for displaying these is really part of the piece. It's not just like a pedestal. And you can specifically see that with like these tables that we made here. I went out of, again, the tabletops are from deadfall, like wood, in this case, box elder, and I've really made an effort to maintain the features of that wood, like the interesting elements, the bug infestations, the discoloration due to, again, with like fungus and stuff like that, the things that really make it like reinforce the wood as part of like a process
and
like
ecosystem.
An ecosystem. And then the bases for the tables kind of reference, and kind of reference back to some of the stuff that we looked at in the very beginning, which is that faux finish and that kind of artificial reproduction of nature, natural forms. Yeah.
And so actually
I had a question, and let me re-invite all of our participants to, put a question in the chat, just with our remaining 10 minutes or so. But I had a question about sort of like using kind of like cast off materials from your primary practice. I wondered how it made you think about that primary practice, sort of because you already know that perhaps you're working on two simultaneous practices.
So
it's like, oh, that would be a really good offcut. Is
that? Yeah, so I think it's like, for me, it's a real dance, because I don't want to be too deliberate about the way that I make, especially doing stuff at work, I don't want to be too deliberate about how I make the offcuts look, because I don't want it to be forced. But at the same time, yeah, it's inescapable to be like, I think I made I made one of those little free libraries, and I made it for a school that's down the road from us. And I definitely made it a slightly non-traditional little free library. The end result being that I have some pretty cool cutoffs, and maybe part of me was like, that would look, having some arches and things like that would look pretty cool.
Meanwhile, I was like, you could have finished that library a week ago if you had made it round. So
yeah, turns out trying to put shingles on the top of a round roof is difficult.
It also uses a lot more shingles. So it looks very interesting and super. I would put a slide in here for you guys, and we'll share later. It off,
but I'm just sort of interested in how it kind of like opens up this sort of aesthetic field for something that we wouldn't usually consider aesthetic, whether it's a kind of like a bit of flotsam of childhood on the floor, or in your domestic space somewhere to kind of, I think this kind of practice really might help one reimagine and reintroduce a kind of sensibility.
Well, when you speak about, a little bit of ephemera of childhood on the floor, I actually have started collecting, because I was like, I'm making an art piece out of this because there are too many of them. But we have all the broken princess crowns and wands. Is like a big part of dress up.
And they're super flimsy.
I have a drawer of them now that I'm like calling like broken dreams or something.
Yes.
I don't know what it'll be called, but it's interesting to have all these weird plastic gems and jewels, and like they're very brittle. But it is, unfortunately and fortunately, it is making us like sometimes more hesitant to throw out things, especially because you can find an interesting quality in almost anything and give yourself a reason to keep it, but at some point there is a little bit of like, we can't function with too much stuff around us.
It's really interesting to sort of navigate that recycling your own waste stream, because at some point, if you were totally faithful to that idea, you would your house would be completely full of everything that you ever had. And so it's like, so it does require, it does introduce like a double take anytime that anything goes out to the recycling or to the trash. It's like we have to but it does. We do also have to be honest with ourselves about like, are we really going to use this in the future? Because a lot of times, if you think about it, you're like, this ball of tape is probably not the thing. It's like, and you only have 1,200 square feet. It's like it definitely,
I imagine it also impacts the kind of judgments you make in bringing anything into the house. So it affects not only how things get thrown away, but how things are consumed. Which is probably something all of us should really do more of.
We've been pretty careful buyers. Interesting, especially because I'm in a PhD program. People I've noticed a lot of academics and are super into books. Like they're like really excited to have a physical book, and I was like, I don't want a physical book. Like I would like a PDF of that.
We got too much artwork on the shelf.
And I think that's literally just because I often am like, I've got all of these other things I'm holding on to, and for me, like the ability to move quickly is very important, and like just having everything on my iPad or my computer has been like really helpful for streamlining that part of my life. But that being said, like when we were trying to clean up our bookshelf recently, it was like really hard to be like, which book should we get rid of? So what do we not need? Haven't
figured out how to make the books into art yet.
We'll work on that. But did you have something to say, Tyler?
No, go ahead.
One thing I did think that was interesting is that we're dealing with so many blocks. We had like 3 different sets of blocks from the kids, and then we decided to make our own unit blocks. So these are our adult unit blocks, which are actually quite beautiful, and the parts of the block that are not, so we were using, again,
reclaimed
wood,
yeah.
which has a lot of inconsistencies, which are quite beautiful. And we actually filled in the
like knots and cracks and flaws in the surface.
So we filled in those voids with wax, tinting it and kind of coloring it, mimicking a little bit of the child
The
like
colors.
colors,
Yeah.
but maybe a little bit more sophisticated this time. And so they have a very nice aesthetic to them. And Nate and I, trying to assemble these after we made them, we're like, oh, now we have to like negotiate again, like kind of an art sculpture, you know. And it was nice to have this kind of back and forth play about who was putting which block where, and then that final assessment of like, do we keep it this way?
Yeah, it really kind of harkened back to our initial collaboration proposal, but in a way that was more like, I guess, informed by like the play that our kids do, almost, in a way, because like you're basically just building a tower, you know, but it's the same kind of dialogue that we're having with each other, you know, when we're making a piece of art.
And one other thing to note is that we actually did use the measurements for these two tables specifically from the objects in our house. So the lower table is actually the same measurement and dimension as our dining room table. And then the taller one is actually the same as our kitchen island. And so we were hopeful that for people visiting the space, that might, in the back of their minds, be a sensation that this is a familiar size.
Kind of like it carries the memory as well of your domestic space.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is probably what my table looks like all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, listen, I think we're right on time here, but I wanted to thank you both very much for, you know, writing out the kind of craziness of the year with us, you know, first of all, and really producing some, you know, great, interesting work. And thank you for your time today. We really appreciate it. And that goes to all of you who are with us now and in the future. So
Thanks so much for joining us. So
yeah, thanks very much. Take care, all.
All right.
bye.